Hi, this is Rob. In this video, I'll provide a brief introduction to the jQuery JavaScript library. jQuery is a free, open-source JavaScript library which simplifies DOM tree traversal and manipulation, as well as event handling and AJAX calls. As I mentioned, this video will be a brief introduction to jQuery. In fact, what I'll do here is show you how to convert this web page, which uses native JavaScript, to make an AJAX call for external data, then dynamically builds the HTML elements and appends them to the DOM into using jQuery. If you'd like an in-depth tutorial, I recommend W3 School's jQuery tutorial site. To get started, I've loaded the existing source for the web page into Visual Studio Code. Now I'll add an HTML script element to include the jQuery library. Now to get the source value for the script, I'll jump over to the jQuery CDN site, click the link to the minified version of jQuery 3, and copy this link to the clipboard. Then I'll go back and actually replace this script element with the one that I just copied. And it's important that the script tag for jQuery comes before the custom script tags, because the JavaScript that's within the custom files will rely on jQuery, so the library has to be loaded by the browser first so it can be referenced in your JavaScript code. Now I'm going to jump into the scripts.js file, and the first thing I'm going to do is replace the window on load function with jQuery's document ready function. So I'll copy this code, go back to Visual Studio, and replace the window on load function with it. Then, because ready is a method being called on the document by jQuery, and it takes an anonymous function, I need to go down to this last line and add a closing parenthesis for the ready method. Now what I'll do is delete this code, add a console.log statement, then go back to the browser and reload the page. And we see our document ready message. So what document ready is doing is it's waiting for the DOM to be built, just like window on load. So here, where we have a $, the $sign is a reference to jQuery. So whenever you see the $sign in the JavaScript, think of it as the browser saying, hey jQuery, I want you to do something for me. And in this case, what the browser is asking jQuery to do is listen for the document to be ready, for the DOM to be built. And then when the DOM is built, or the document is ready, execute the code within this anonymous function. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to replace this console.log statement with some of the code that was here before. And what I'm doing now is I'm creating a constant named data file path, and I'm pointing it to the data folder and a context.json file. And if we look at this file real quick, if you watch the prior video in this playlist, you'll recall that this is simply an array of object literals which contains the data for our contacts. And then I was passing the data file path into the fetch error handler function. So if we take a look at that function, we're using a JavaScript fetch, passing it the data file path, and then getting the response, checking to see if it's not okay, and if that's the case, we're throwing a new error with the status text of the response. If it is the case that response is okay, then I'm going to return the text from the response and pass it into the then method as data. And then I'll parse the data into a constant named context, log this out, and then pass it to the process data function. Process data simply loops through the contacts, and for each contact in the contacts which are passed in, it'll get the name, the email, and the cell and put them in these variables. Then I'll call the contact constructor function, passing the name, the email, and the contact cell, which will return a new instance of a contact object. And if I open contact.js real quick, we'll see it's simply a constructor function which takes the name, email, and cell and sets its properties to those values. Then when I have an instance of a new contact, I pass it to the add contact function, which creates new HTML elements and appends them to the DOM. So when the page is loaded, we see the data from the AJAX call and the dynamic elements which are on the page with a click event handler bound to the element holding the show cell text. If you'd like a more detailed walkthrough of the existing functionality, I recommend going and watching the prior video in this playlist. Now, continuing on with our jQuery conversion, I'm going to comment out the fetch error handling function and add a new function call to a get data function, which will take the data file path. So I created the function, and now I'm going to replace the existing fetch implementation with a jQuery implementation. And that's going to be to use the jQuery Ajax API. And what this code will do is it will use jQuery to call the Ajax method, passing the data file path. And when the Ajax call is done, it'll execute the code in the anonymous function and write success to the console. If, however, the Ajax call fails, it'll execute the code in this anonymous function and write fail to the console. So I'll go ahead and save this and go back to the browser, and we see success. If I go to the network tab and click on contacts.json, we see it's a GET request for the contacts.json file, and the response shows the array of JSON objects. However, if I were to go back to the code and change the file name to contacts123, which doesn't exist, if we jump back in the browser, now we see the fail message because contacts123.json doesn't exist. So we're going to revert this back to the proper file name and look at the old fetch code. So we fetched the data file, and then we passed response into this anonymous function. So I'll do the same and console.log response. And if we come back, we see our array of object literals. Now notice I don't have to take the response and call the text method on it to get the text out of the response, and I don't have to parse the string of data into an object. So I should be able to take that and pass it to the process data function just like I did up here. And in fact, to keep things consistent, I'm going to change that to contacts instead of response. Now if I go back to the browser, we see we still have our contacts, and now we have the contacts displayed on the page and the click event handler bound to the show cell text. So with that working, I'll jump back into VS Code and delete the fetch error handler function and the commented out code. So now we're passing contacts, which is the result of calling Ajax and passing the data file path, into the process data function like we did before. And all process data is doing is traversing the contacts we passed in, and for each one getting the current contact, getting the values, and instantiating the new contact. Then it's passing that new contact to the add contact function. And as we saw previously, the add contact function is dynamically creating the HTML elements and appending them to the page. So what I want to do next is replace this native JavaScript, which creates the elements, sets the attributes and values, and appends it to the page, with some jQuery code. So I'm going to start out by renaming the add contact function to add contact backup, and then create a new add contact function. And this way we'll be able to compare the code that we're writing in jQuery to the native JavaScript code that we have in the prior function. So the first thing I'll do is create the contacts list variable and set it equal to going to the DOM and getting the element where the ID is contacts list. But instead of calling document get element by ID, I could simply use the $ for jQuery and then pass the ID of the element that I want to get, prefaced with the $. So if I save this and go back to the browser, we see we have a pointer to the contacts list unordered list element 3 times because we go into the add contact function 3 times because we have 3 contacts that we want to display on the page. So what I want to do now is I want to start building out these HTML elements and setting their attributes and appending them to one another so that ultimately we could append them to the contacts list. Now in native JavaScript, where I created a variable for the contacts list and then one for the contacts list item and the contact anchor and so on, and then appended each of these elements to its parent as I went through the function, and ultimately appended the contact list item to the contacts list, in jQuery I can consolidate this into a more concise implementation. So first of all, instead of creating a variable to hold the contact list item, I'm just going to use jQuery to get a reference to it. And now that I have a reference, I could append directly to it. And for starters, what I want to append is a list item. So instead of creating a variable and calling the document create element and passing it the list item text, in jQuery I could just say, hey jQuery, create a list item for me. So if I save this and go back to the browser, although we don't have anything displayed on the page, if I inspect the element and then expand the unordered list element, we see the 3 list items have been created and appended to the contact list. Now let's go back and actually put some content in those list items. So I've implemented these, and the next thing I want to do is create the contact anchor. So I'll jump back up here and append to the list item a new anchor element. And then I want to set the href attribute equal to the string mail to and the email address of the contact which was passed in. So if I go back to the jQuery code, I can call the attribute method, passing the attribute that I want to modify or add to the anchor tag, and that's the aref. And I want to set its value equal to this string. And finally, I want to set the text of the anchor tag, so what will be displayed on the page, equal to the contact's name. So if I save this and go back, now we see we have our list of contact names. And if we look down in the code, we'll see the list item with the anchor tag and the text for each contact. Alright, so we'll get rid of the email and we'll move on to the cell. So for the cell, I don't want to append it to the anchor tag. I want to append it to the list item. So I'll add another append directly to the list item, then create a span and set its class attribute to hidden because that's what I did down here. Then I want to create a text node which has a colon, space, and a contact cell, and append that to the contact cell element. So instead of creating the text node itself, again, I could come up here and set the text directly. And if I take the hidden off of this and save and go back to the browser, now we see the cell phone number displayed. And if I go back and add the class name, now the cell phone number is hidden. But if we look down in the code, we still see the span with the cell number, and now the hidden class is applied. Alright, so the cell is done. And now I have a contact cell launcher element. And that's the element that's going to have the text show cell, which will get the click event listener bound to it, and will hide the show cell text and display the cell number. So again, up here I want to append another span. I want to set the class name to alert. I want to set the text to show cell. And if we save this, now we see the show cell text. And right now nothing happens when I click the show cell text because I haven't bound the click event listener yet. So that's what I'll do now. So for the click event listener, I want to bind that to the span element, not to the list item. So I'll add the click method here, which will be an ES6 function that when this span element is clicked, I'll execute these 2 lines of code. But remember, I no longer have the contact cell launcher element or contact cell element variables that I can reference. So what I need to do is add an ID to the span that has the show cell text and to the span that has the contact cell number. And to do that, I could use the jQuery attribute method and pass the ID and set it to some unique value. But I have a problem in that in the add contact function, there's nothing here that can act as a unique value for the ID attribute for either span. But if I jump down to the process data function, where I'm looping through the contacts and then sending the contact to the add contact function, if I modify what I'm passing in each time through the for each loop to also pass in the index for the current element in the array, I can pass that index to the add contact function. Then back up here, I'll add the index, and then for the IDs, I can make them unique using the index. Now, the first time I add a contact, this span will have an ID attribute with a value of cell underscore and then the index that I passed in to the add contact function, which the first time through should be 0. and the span with the show cell text will have an ID of alert_0. Then I can use jQuery to find the element where the ID is equal to alert_index and call hide. And the same thing for the cell, except instead of hiding it, I want to show it. Now if I save this code and go back to the browser, refresh the page just to make sure we don't have any errors, if I click on show cell, I see the cell numbers for the appropriate contacts. Then jumping back into the code and looking at our backup function, we've implemented the cell launcher and bound the click event listener. Then the only thing that was left to do was append the elements to the DOM, which we've done as we move through the jQuery code. So we no longer need this function, and we've finished refactoring this code from native JavaScript to using jQuery.